Thank you. Thank you very much for your introduction. You're going to have to bear with me a little bit. I just got off the flight from Stockholm and arrived here in Syracuse at 6:30. I heard I had to give a talk tonight, so I've been traveling, as you can see, and I do a lot of it lately. Basically, trying to organize resistance against the way things are going today around the world. Gather support for Indigenous peoples, gather support for Mother Earth. This particular trip was really planned around a fact-finding trip to Greenland. So I was up to Greenland last week and learned a lot in a few days. Indeed, the ice is melting. But tonight, I think we'll be covering a wide range of subjects as long as I can last up here. But I want to talk about the history of human rights in the United Nations and Indigenous peoples. I want to touch on the Doctrine of Discovery, and then talk about the melting ice in Greenland. The Haudenosaunee has been active from the beginning. I would imagine if we went back into time and so forth, we'd find that the leaders and the people were doing just about what we do today, moving about and being helpful and trying to ensure the mandate that we have, which is for the future generations. Very important that we recognize extreme necessity today to think very clearly about that responsibility. 7 generations, it's very real. You know, it wasn't that far back when we didn't have the crisis that we're facing today, but it was building. There's some good news, always good news. And the first is that this past June, at the United Nations in Geneva, the newly constituted Human Rights Council, in their first intersessional meeting, took the draft Declaration on the Rights of the World's Indigenous People as a #1 priority. We had been advised that that would be happening, but that was a rumor, and we weren't sure. And then we had been advised that our arch enemies in the international discussion, which is basically what we call the Kansas Coalition, which is Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, and always lurking UK. We heard that they refused to be a part of the Human Rights Council for whatever reason. So that meant that possibility of accepting the draft declaration was real. Well, there was a another rumor, which wasn't true, which indeed turned out to be that, yes, there was one of the Kansas states with the new Human Rights Council, and that was Canada. But anyway, they took the draft declaration that we've been working on, you might say, from the beginning, although we didn't know that when we traveled over there in 1977. 1977, Haudenosaunee was a major leader in this move into the international field. Now, the reason why we went to Geneva in 1977 was we couldn't find justice here. And so we had to get out of the box, so to speak, and move into the international field, which we knew about, but hadn't been involved in for quite some time. It was Discahe way back in 1923 who made the initial efforts moving into the League of Nations in Geneva. He was successful in bringing the mission and bringing the story to the international field, although he was not accepted by the League of Nations. Sometime around 1971 and 72, directly after we were having problems here, if you remember, on Route 81. Anybody remember that? At any rate, we were meeting in New York City, and at that time, the coalition of indigenous nations, and we were calling ourselves who we were at that time, the people who generally get out there internationally, which are treaty nations. Lakotas, they always fight treaties. Western Shoshones, they fight treaties. People have problems, will go to the UN. Most of the rest of the American Indian nations go to Washington, and they lobby for what they need on their territories. We don't do that. At any rate, in that meeting down there, they talked about the need to move to the international field, and they asked the Six Nations to take a lead role. And at that time, they designated specifically Chief Paulus, Irving Paulus, and myself to be the runners, so to speak. And we accepted that. And then later on, a man from Guatemala had a vision, and he thought that in the year of the 500th anniversary of the so-called discovery of America, that the indigenous people should be within the halls of the United Nations. He had a great vision. And he met with us in 74, and we talked about that, and it was kind of far away, but nevertheless, it was clear to us that we needed to have some international support and help in the struggles that were going on here in America. If you remember, Wounded Knee was one of the things that occurred during that time. Also, after Route 81, there was the so-called takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in 1972, then Wounded Knee in 73, Kanyenke and the Mohawks up in the Adirondacks in 74. We met in Oglala country, 75, and they were still fighting. They were still fighting pretty fiercely, and that was 75, I believe, is when 2 FBI agents were killed, and one of Joe Stuntz in particular was killed in the Jumping Bull Ranch in Oglala, 75. And that turned into a whole other event. The American Indian movement came about. Early on, in 1970, they were at Onondaga asking for direction and support, and they were there because they knew that we were probably the last of the traditional style of governance in the country. And I would say today that Onondaga Nation, Tonawanda, Seneca Nation, and Tuscarora Nation are the last 3 completely independent, old-style Indian governments in North America. All the rest of the governments, whether they're in Canada or the United States, has a federal state presence, provinces. But we don't. We're still independent. As I came through the border tonight, this afternoon, with my Haudenosaunee passport, it was a black man. And he says, "Whoa," he says, "once in a blue moon," he said. "This is great. Nobody ever sees these things," he says. And he stamped it and welcomed me home. And that's been the reaction to our return. As of yet, to experience any real problems at the border. But I think with the change at Homeland Security, I think we're really going to have to advance our independence more clearly. We're going to have to upgrade our passports. We're going to have to take the same precautions that any country in the world does with a document that is used for international travel. Times have changed, and we have to keep up with it. Trying to do that. At any rate, during all those years of gathering, I remember we were on our way to a meeting in the Dakotas to be ready to go. I think this was in 77, spring of 77. And we had started out for the meeting in that spring. We had a van load of chiefs. And halfway to our destination, we got the word that one of our leaders had passed away here, Lloyd Henhock. So we turned around immediately and came home. And we didn't attend the meeting, and we kind of got caught up in our affairs to the point that Russell Means showed up at our Longhouse, one Six Nation meeting, and he said, "I have to talk to your council." He said, we are getting ready to travel, and we haven't heard from you guys, and we're wondering how you're doing." And I said, "Oh yeah, that's right." So he did address the council. He said that we must go. He said, the Haudenosaunee must go. He said, because if you don't go, he says, might as well not any of us go. So that was the style of perception of our leadership at the time. Now, we didn't think of it in that way, but apparently other people did. And so we renewed our efforts, and the first thing we had to do, of course, was to find out what a travel document was. Now, we're not used to that, and so we said, well, if you need a passport, then we're going to have to make one. And so we did. We made a passport and issued it at Onondaga, and Audrey Shenandoah was the secretary of the Six Nation, and still is, and still signs those documents. And so we made our passport. And we said, well, you know, this is a good test because we'll find out if they're serious about us by the passport. And so when we arrived, I don't know how many people here were in that original group. Does anybody here raise their hands? What? I'm the last of the Mohegans here? Well, that's true, though. A few years back in Geneva, we asked for a show of hands of how many was in that original party in 1977, and I think, about 5 or 6 people put their hands up. So times change, things move on. At any rate, we cooled our heels. We cooled our heels at the Swiss frontier, they call it over there, when you're standing there with your passports, and they were running back and forth, and we sat quietly. And it went on for several hours. They would come back and they'd ask a question, then they'd go back again, come back again. Finally, they said, well, here's the way we're going to deal with this. We're going to issue you a document which you put in your passport, and when you leave, you give it back to us. And so we had our own caucus. We sat there and we talked about it. We said, well, what do you think? Well, they said, it's not an American passport, is it? Nope. Let's go. We're right here. So we did. We accepted that and we went. Essentially, it was a document that said we were never there. That's what we found out later, but we didn't know much about international stuff anyway. And we were there by the invitation of the international NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and they were there on discrimination against indigenous peoples. And we didn't know the difference between an invitation from NGOs or invitation from states. So it was, but it was an extraordinary event. It certainly was. And we spent several weeks there, if I remember. And it was an extraordinary meeting. Our first venture, we came and we brought our Indian clothes, and we were prepared. So the very next day, we got an invitation from the mayor of Geneva. Would the Haudenosaunee, and using our proper name, would the Haudenosaunee and all of our Indian friends come to a reception in the gardens of Geneva? And that was quite an invitation. And so we, of course, alerted everybody, and everybody dressed fully, and we went to this most amazing meeting. And they were, of course, standing there in their full regalia. You know, they have these bands across here and great big gold things hanging. They had drummers. They were lined up, and there was tables of crystal and silver, china, food. And everybody was very elegant. Well, we know formality, you know, when we see it. And so we approached, and the mayor stepped forward. And his first words were, "Is Diskahe here?" He asked for the Cayuga chief, Diskahe. who in this particular time was Harvey Longboat. And Harvey couldn't make it, but he wrote a letter. He says, if somebody by any chance asks, he says, well, I'll have a letter. It's okay. And even further, he said, we'll make a gestoa for the person that asks, if they do. But in order that the person doesn't put the hat on and walk away, we made it just a little too small to wear. And you wouldn't know that by looking at it. So sure enough, the mayor himself says, there's Discahe here. And he told a story about how Discahe came to Geneva in 1923, bringing charges against Canada for taking over by force the Council of Chiefs, 6 nations in Oswego. And he brought charges, but he couldn't get to the League of Nations. He was blocked by Great Britain because Canada was still a protectorate of Great Britain. And so the Labour Party of Geneva hired the largest hall they could find in Geneva, and they organized a meeting for him to speak to the public. And they said, as he told us, that cars and people were lined up for miles trying to get into this building to hear this Haudenosaunee chief, this Iroquois speaker. And he was tired, this guy was tired, and usually carrying that big bag of papers that we all carry when we get to be leaders, evidence of whatever, trying to prove a point. And he gave his story. Everybody heard that. And then on his way out, there was a little boy kind of pulling on his pant leg, and he stopped and looked at him, and the little boy just wanted to say hello to this chief. And so he stopped and talked to the boy for some time. Put his bag down and talked to him. Then he went on. So the mayor said, I was that little boy. And he said, I never forgot that. And he said, I was the one that helped you get through the frontier today. And I'm here to tell you, he said, any time that you come to Geneva, you will never have a problem to enter. He said, Geneva is like a small city-state. We have so many international people coming here that we're independent. And he said, the Haudenosaunee will be honored. And so we gave him the hat. And he spent the rest of the day trying to put it on. Indians have a funny sense of humor. So we learned something. Then he said, I want you to come to my office tomorrow. He says, bring your leaders and come up to my office. He says, I want to give you some instruction. So the next day we were up there. It's an old town, beautiful section of Geneva. Everything was new to us. You know, we were first time in Europe and seeing all these buildings and seeing some really old buildings. And as we came to his office, I could hear a lot of voices, kind of angry, shouting voices inside. And then the door opens and out comes this group of men. Everybody's got red faces. And he's the last one out, and he's yelling something at him. Oh, and then he sees us standing there, and he says, oh, he says, come on in. So we come in. And he says, 5,000 spies is enough for anybody. And that was, he had both the Russian and the USA delegations in there and was talking about how many spies they had there in Geneva. And so he told us, he said, I want to warn you. He said, anybody that says to you in English, can I help you, is a spy. Because if you say yes, then there they are interpreting everything between whatever you're saying. He said, over here, he says, it's honorable to be a spy. He said, they make money. Information is valuable. And there are so many different people here, so there are many, many spies, so let me warn you. And it was a fair warning to us, because we had no idea at all. But that was welcoming us into the international field of politics. And we've had our hard times with that. We learned. And so the good news is that after all those years, the draft declaration for the rights of indigenous peoples, the world's indigenous peoples, has been accepted as a declaration now into the United Nations. And that was June. By a straw poll that I took, consensus was it was about 83% agreeable to the indigenous people and 17% very seriously not. However, the consensus was it was better to get it through while the opportunity was there rather than wait. And also, we didn't have much to say about it. The Working Group for Indigenous Populations is an arm of the Human Rights Division, and it is run by states. And although we negotiated the original standards, we had to battle with the states all down through the years to maintain that. And as we got closer to the reality of it being a declaration, the battle intensified. And it was 11 years that we worked on that particular draft declaration after we presented it to the Commission on Human Rights. 11 years. And we were stalled every time. And we wouldn't give and they wouldn't give. And that's the way it went. But we were getting better, and I think with the new acceleration of education presented to us by Syracuse University, we're going to get better still. Because it is important to be in these international fields. It is important to defend yourself, because if you're not there, things go on anyway, whether you're there or not. So our adventure really took fruit. And today, after all these years, we have made a step. Mind you, it's just a step. Now the next step will be that this declaration will now go in front of the General Assembly for a vote of approval. And then naturally, the same ones that voted against it will vote again against it. Now, in the council, the Human Rights Council, the newly constituted Human Rights Council, 30 nations voted for the draft declaration. 2 nations voted against it, Russia and Canada. So there was Canada, there was Kansas. As soon as I heard that Canada was in the Human Rights Commission, our council, I knew they would be the negative voice. Of course. But only 2. 13 abstentions. So it went through. Now, The General Assembly is much larger, so we'll see what occurs. But regardless of that, I would imagine that it will be voted in there as well. And I think that from there on comes the battle of that 13% or 17% that we didn't like. We're going to have to fight through. It's another fight.